The fluorescent lights of the Sterling Global boardroom had never felt quite so clinical, so devoid of the warmth I once associated with this building. I sat there, my posture perfect, despite the heavy fatigue pulling at my shoulders, my hands resting instinctively over my belly. It was a secret I had only shared with my father an hour ago, thinking, perhaps naively, that the news of a grandchild would finally soften the edges of a man made of granite and spreadsheets. But Arthur Sterling didn't do sentiment. He didn't even look me in the eye as he adjusted his silk tie, his movements practiced and cold. He cleared his throat, a sound that usually signaled the start of a multi-million-dollar negotiation, but today it was the sound of a guillotine falling. I watched him carefully, noting how he stared at a spot just above my head, refusing to acknowledge the life growing inside me, or the 15 years of blood, sweat, and tears I had poured into his legacy. He spoke with a terrifyingly calm precision, delivering the sentence that was designed to shatter my world. He told me that due to an upcoming restructuring, a shift in the company's strategic direction, and my own clearly changing priorities, they had decided to terminate my contract. He used corporate jargon like a shield, never once saying the word pregnant, though it hung in the air between us like a thick, poisonous fog. He honestly believed he was protecting his empire from a liability, cutting away what he perceived as a weak link before it could slow down his relentless climb. As he pushed the severance papers across the polished mahogany table, his face remained a mask of professional indifference. He expected me to break. He expected the tears of a daughter betrayed, or perhaps a desperate plea for mercy, a promise that I would work twice as hard just to keep my seat at his table. But in that moment, something shifted deep within me. The scales fell from my eyes, and I saw Arthur not as a titan or a mentor, but as a man who had traded his soul for a balance sheet. So, instead of crying, I did the one thing he didn't anticipate. I smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy or relief, but a sharp, predatory grin of realization. He had no idea what was coming next, and he had no idea that by casting me out, he had just handed me the keys to his destruction. Growing up as the daughter of Arthur Sterling was less like a childhood and more like a prolonged internship at a high-pressure hedge fund. While other girls were playing with dolls, I was learning the nuances of maritime law and the volatility of global fuel prices. My father was a titan, a man whose reputation was built on a foundation of ruthlessness and an uncanny ability to spot a competitor's weakness before they even knew they were vulnerable. I spent my entire 20s working 18-hour days, often sleeping on the leather sofa in my office, just to ensure a shipment from Shanghai arrived 3 hours ahead of schedule. I sacrificed my personal life, my friendships, and my health to prove that I was more than just the founder's daughter. I wanted to be the successor he deserved. I turned failing regional ports into gold mines through sheer force of will. I negotiated deals in Singapore and Rotterdam that his most seasoned executives said were impossible. I wasn't just a cog in the Sterling Global machine. I was the engine that kept it running while Arthur played golf with senators. But to my father, people were never truly people. They were merely assets, and assets had to be liquidated if they stopped being perfectly efficient. The moment I told him I was expecting, I watched the light of recognition leave his eyes. There was no flicker of joy, no shadow of a grandfather's pride. Instead, I saw him calculating the cost of my maternity leave, the perceived dip in my focus, and the potential distraction of a child in the boardroom. He saw a leak in his ship, and in his world, you plug the leak or you sink the boat. He chose to throw me overboard. When I finally stood up, the chair scraping against the marble floor, I didn't reach for the severance papers. I left them sitting there, a silent insult to the years I had given him. I walked out of that boardroom with my head held high, passing through the corridors of power I had helped build.
The security guards, men I had known for a decade, men whose families I had helped during the holidays, looked away in collective shame. They knew what had happened. The news of the restructuring had traveled through the office like a wildfire. I gathered the few personal items I kept in my office, a photo of my mother, a silver pen, and a single notebook, and placed them into a cardboard box. I felt the weight of the building pressing down on me, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying it for him. I was carrying it for myself. As I walked towards the elevator, I felt the baby kick for the first time, a small rhythmic thud against my palm. It was a reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight anymore. I had someone else to build for now. Arthur thought he was stripping me of my power, but he had actually done the opposite. He had unchained me. For years, I had been the silent architect of Sterling Global's digital infrastructure, the one who moved the pieces on the board while he took the credit. I knew every vulnerability in his supply chain, every untapped market he was too arrogant to see, and every major client who stayed with the firm not because of the Sterling name, but because of the trust they had in me. As the elevator doors closed on the top floor, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my personal phone. I didn't call a lawyer, and I didn't call a friend to vent. I dialed a number I had kept tucked away for months, a contingency plan I hoped I'd never have to use. "It's time," I said into the receiver, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "The Sterling era is over. Launch the prototype. We're going live tonight." I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the sun hitting my face, and as I walked to my car, I didn't look back. The war had begun, and Arthur Sterling was about to learn that the most dangerous enemy is the one you taught to fight.
The transition from a high-rise executive suite to a cramped, oil-stained garage on the outskirts of the city should have felt like a defeat, but to me, it felt like a sanctuary. While Arthur spent the first month after my firing toasted by his board for optimizing human capital, I was scrubbing grease off a concrete floor to make room for a server rack. I didn't need a mahogany desk or a fleet of assistants to be dangerous. I needed a stable internet connection and the proprietary source code I had spent 3 years developing under a private LLC, a legal ghost entity my father had been too arrogant to investigate. I called it Nova Logistics, a name that signified both a new beginning and a star that burns with a sudden blinding intensity. My lead developer, Marcus, was the first to join me. He had been the youngest lead at Sterling Global, a boy wonder I'd scouted from a hackathon, and when he heard what Arthur had done, he didn't even wait to be fired. He walked out with his laptop and a backpack and showed up at my garage door 2 hours later. We worked in a fever dream of caffeine and ambition, the air thick with the hum of cooling fans and the scent of stale coffee. I wasn't just building a rival company, I was building a corrective lens for an industry that had grown blind and bloated. Arthur's empire relied on the Sterling way, a prehistoric method of intimidation, manual paperwork, and back-channel favors that worked in the 90s but was failing in a world of real-time data. My system, the Nova prototype, was different. It used predictive AI to anticipate port congestion before it happened and automated customs clearing in a way that reduced a 3-day wait to 3 hours. I sat there in the dim glow of triple monitors, my growing belly pressed against the edge of a plastic folding table, feeling the baby kick every time a line of code compiled successfully. It was a strange, beautiful juxtaposition, nurturing a life and a revolution at the same time. I reached out to the hidden layer of the shipping world, the mid-level managers and independent vessel owners who were tired of Arthur's late payments and ego-driven demands. I didn't approach them as the disgraced daughter, but as the woman who had actually solved their problems for the last decade. I spoke their language, I knew their pain points, and most importantly, I offered them a seat at a table where they weren't just line items on a ledger. By the second month, the garage was no longer just a workshop, it was a war room. We had maps pinned to the walls with red strings connecting the vulnerabilities in Sterling Global's Pacific routes. I knew that Arthur's biggest contract, a massive electronics conglomerate based in Singapore, was up for renewal. He assumed it was a formality, a legacy agreement that would never change hands. He was so busy celebrating his leaner payroll that he didn't notice the quiet migration of his top-tier data analysts to my small, unregistered firm. He didn't see the silent shadow I was casting over his empire. Every morning, I would check the industry news, seeing photos of him at charity galas, looking smug and untouchable. He thought he had silenced me. He thought the pregnancy brain he joked about behind closed doors had turned me into a housewife. He had no clue that every hour he spent at his country club, I spent weaponizing the very tools he had taught me to use. I wasn't just planning to compete, I was planning to make his entire business model obsolete before my daughter took her first breath. The prototype was live, the servers were screaming, and the first domino was wobbling. I looked at the digital clock on the wall, 3 in the morning. I rubbed my back, smiled at Marcus, and hit the execute key on the Singapore proposal. The ghost in the machine was finally ready to scream.
The first major blow didn't come with a shout, but with the silent, cold chime of an incoming high-priority alert on Arthur Sterling's encrypted terminal. It was 9 a.m. in New York, which meant it was late evening in Singapore, and the board of Global Tech, the electronics giant that accounted for nearly 40% of Sterling Global's annual revenue, had just finished their quarterly review. I sat in my garage, my feet propped up on a plastic crate to ease the swelling, watching the real-time data feed Marcus had rigged to monitor public logistics filings. When the notification flashed green, I felt a surge of adrenaline so sharp it made my breath hitch. They hadn't just requested a quote, they had officially served Arthur with a notice of non-renewal. Within 6 minutes, my personal encrypted line buzzed. It was the CEO of Global Tech, a man who had known me since I was an intern. He didn't ask for my father. He asked for the women who had personally saved his supply chain during the 2022 port strikes. I spoke to him with a calm authority that I hadn't felt in years, detailing how Nova's automated routing had already mapped out a 20% cost reduction for his holiday shipping window. By the time I hung up, the first pillar of my father's empire hadn't just cracked, it had turned to dust. I knew exactly what was happening across town in that mahogany boardroom. Arthur would be screaming at his vice presidents, demanding to know how a startup with no physical headquarters had poached a legacy client. He would be looking for a face to punch, a name to sue, but all he found was a digital shadow named Nova. As the weeks progressed, the shockwaves intensified. I was 8 months pregnant now, moving slower but thinking faster than I ever had in my life. The physical strain was immense, but it paled in comparison to the satisfaction of watching the Sterling Global stock price begin its jagged descent. Arthur tried to fight back using the old-school methods, legal threats, predatory pricing, and attempts to buy out my suppliers. But he was fighting a ghost. He sent private investigators to find my office, and when they reported back that I was working out of a residential garage, he reportedly laughed, calling it a hobby project to his remaining board members. That was his fatal mistake. He equated physical opulence with power, while I knew that in the new era, power was nothing more than the speed of information. Every time he lowered his prices to undercut me, my AI adjusted Nova's margins in milliseconds, keeping us profitable while he bled cash just to prove a point. The stress began to show on him. I saw a grainy paparazzi photo of him leaving a late-night meeting, his face haggard, his signature silk tie loosened and crooked. He looked like a man who was finally realizing that the tide was going out, and he was the only one left on the beach without a boat. Then came the night the world narrowed down to a single room. I was staring at a logistics map of the North Atlantic when the first contraction hit, a sharp, undeniable tightening that signaled the end of my pregnancy and the beginning of my new life. I didn't panic. I saved my work, pushed back from the folding table, and called Marcus. "The system is on autopilot for the next 72 hours, I told him, my voice strained but steady. Don't let him breathe. As I was wheeled into the delivery room, the news broke on the financial channels.
Sterling Global had lost its second-largest contract to an unnamed tech disruptor. While Arthur was losing his legacy, I was bringing mine into the world. The moment I held my daughter, a tiny, fierce creature with the same stubborn brow as her mother, I realized that the weakness my father had fired me for was actually my greatest armor. I wasn't just fighting for market share anymore. I was fighting to ensure that she would never have to ask permission to be powerful. I fell asleep in that hospital bed with a newborn in my arms and the sound of my father's empire crumbling in the background, a symphony of justice that was only just beginning to reach its crescendo.
The fallout was no longer a quiet internal bleed. It was a public hemorrhage that the financial world watched with a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. Within 3 weeks of my daughter's birth, the Sterling Global logo, once a symbol of unshakable maritime dominance, became the face of corporate obsolescence. Arthur tried every trick in his weathered playbook, attempting to smear Nova Logistics as an unstable, unregulated flash in the pan. He went on national business news, his face purple with suppressed rage, claiming that his former associate had stolen trade secrets. But the narrative didn't stick. The industry knew that I hadn't stolen his secrets. I had simply taken my own brain and my own innovation with me when he showed me the door. While I sat in a rocking chair with Maya tucked against my chest, navigating the hazy, sleepless joy of new motherhood, I was also navigating the total collapse of my father's ego. I watched on a tablet as his board of directors, men who had toasted his ruthlessness for decades, began to resign one by one. They weren't jumping ship because of a moral awakening. They were jumping because Nova's software had made Sterling's manual infrastructure look like a horse and buggy in the age of the jet engine. Arthur's desperate attempts to litigate me into submission failed when my legal team, a group of hungry, brilliant young lawyers who worked for equity rather than hourly fees, pointed out that the proprietary software Arthur claimed was his actually belonged to an independent entity I had registered years before my pregnancy. Every trap he set for me only ended up snapping shut on his own fingers. By the second month of Maya's life, Sterling Global's credit rating was downgraded to junk status. The banks, sensing blood in the water, began calling in their loans. Arthur's personal wealth was tied up in the company's stock, and as the price plummeted from $80 to $9, he was forced to sell his penthouse, his collection of vintage cars, and finally, the very building that bore our name. I received a frantic late-night call from his assistant, a woman who had stayed out of a misplaced sense of loyalty, begging me to take a meeting. She sounded terrified. Arthur hadn't left his office in 3 days, and the smell of expensive scotch and desperation was reportedly seeping through the vents. I didn't answer that night. I waited. I wanted him to sit in that silence, surrounded by the ghosts of the empire he thought was more important than his own flesh and blood. I wanted him to feel the exact weight of the coldness he had shown me in that boardroom. When I finally agreed to see him, it wasn't at his office, and it certainly wasn't at my garage. I invited him to a neutral public park. I arrived with Maya in a stroller, wearing a simple sundress and sneakers, a far cry from the power suits I used to wear to please him. Arthur looked 20 years older. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes were bloodshot, and the arrogant tilt of his chin had been replaced by a weary, defeated slump. He didn't ask how his granddaughter was. He didn't apologize. Instead, he looked at me and whispered, "How much?" He wanted me to buy him out, to save him from the public humiliation of total bankruptcy. He wanted me to use my success to provide him a golden parachute so he could disappear with his pride intact. I looked at the man who had fired me for being a mother. Then I looked at my daughter, who was reaching for a falling leaf, and I felt a profound sense of peace. I told him I wouldn't buy his company to save his reputation. I would buy it at a liquidation auction for pennies on the dollar,
and I would strip the Sterling name from every single ship, dock, and office. I told him he wasn't being rescued. He was being replaced. As I pushed the stroller away, leaving him trembling on a park bench, I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't the money I'd made. It was the fact that he no longer had the power to make me angry.
The final takeover of Sterling Global did not feel like a conquest. It felt like a homecoming to a house that had been thoroughly cleaned of its rot. When the auction hammer finally fell, I acquired the remains of my father's life's work for less than the cost of a single cargo ship. The day I walked back into the headquarters at the corner of Liberty and South, the gold-plated Sterling letters were already being pried off the granite facade by a construction crew. I stepped into the lobby with Maya strapped to my chest in a carrier, the soft rhythm of her breathing a stark contrast to the sharp, frantic energy that used to define this space. The employees who remained, the ones who had survived the layoffs and the chaos, didn't look at me with fear. They looked at me with a desperate, burgeoning hope. They knew that the woman who had built the most efficient logistics system in the world was now their CEO, and more importantly, they knew I was a leader who valued the human element over the bottom line. I didn't head for the top floor immediately. Instead, I spent the morning in the break room and the IT departments, listening. I realized then that my father's greatest failure wasn't his lack of technical foresight, but his belief that power was something to be hoarded rather than shared. He had built a kingdom of glass, and it had shattered the moment someone threw a stone of genuine innovation. My first act as the head of the newly merged Nova-Sterling Alliance was to implement a radical restructuring that would have made Arthur's blood boil. I converted the executive dining room into a state-of-the-art childcare center and mandated that no employee would ever be forced to choose between a promotion and a family milestone. We weren't just moving boxes and tracking ships anymore. We were proving that a multi-billion-dollar enterprise could function with empathy as its primary operating system. The Sterling way was officially dead, replaced by a culture of transparency and agility. When I finally made my way up to the penthouse office, the same room where I had been fired months earlier, the mahogany table was gone. In its place stood a modular glass workspace that allowed the natural light to flood every corner. I sat in the chair my father once occupied, but I didn't feel like a queen on a throne. I felt like an architect who had finally finished the foundation of a building that would last for generations. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the harbor, watching the first Nova-branded vessel pull into the dock, its automated systems syncing perfectly with our grid. It was a beautiful, seamless dance of technology and human effort. Arthur never did come to the ribbon-cutting ceremony. According to the few associates who still spoke to him, he had retired to a small cottage upstate, spending his days brooding over old ledger books and refusing to turn on the news. I sent him a photo of Maya once, along with a copy of our first annual report showing record-breaking growth and employee satisfaction scores. He never replied, but I didn't need him to. My validation no longer came from his approval. It came from the thriving community I had built and the quiet strength I saw in my daughter's eyes every morning. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting a golden glow over the city I had conquered, I stood in my office and watched Maya take her very first steps across the carpet. She wobbled, determined and focused, until she reached my hands and laughed. In that moment, the cycle of coldness and corporate cruelty was officially broken. I hadn't just taken my father's company, I had redeemed his legacy by making it something worthy of the future. I smiled, not the sharp, predatory smile from the boardroom, but one of deep, enduring contentment. He had no idea what was coming next, but I did. I was building a world where my daughter would never have to smile at a man who tried to diminish her worth because she would already own the sky he was standing under.